Okay, good evening everyone. It's 7 o'clock, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'll start with just a brief introduction, and that should allow a few minutes for some more people to get signed on. Good evening and welcome to the My Horse University and Extension Horse Quest's live webcast on Pasture Rotation. Our presenter this evening is Tom Guthrie from Michigan State University Extension. Tom is a statewide equine extension educator for Michigan State University. His role for Michigan State University Extension is to develop and provide statewide accessibility to educational programming in regard to equine and swine management, including environmental management. He has bachelor's degrees in animal science and forestry and a master's degree in animal science, all from Southern Illinois University. Please note that you are able to ask questions during the presentation using the text chat to the left of your screen, and questions tonight will be answered by Dr. Christine Skelly, an associate professor in the Department of Animal Science at Michigan State University and a co-founder of My Horse University. She earned her doctorate at Texas A&M with a research focus on equine nutrition exercise physiology, and she's currently the director of curriculum for My Horse University and is responsible for developing online horse management courses. Our presentation tonight will be recorded and uploaded to our website by the end of the week if you would like to review it or recommend it to someone else. And at this time, I will turn the presentation over to Tom.
Well, thanks, Amanda. And also thanks to Dr. Skelly for her willingness to facilitate any questions. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to be a part of My Horse University as a speaker. So let's start off with a general overview of this presentation. First, I'll go through some grazing strategies that we typically may see on a horse farm. Second, we'll talk about some considerations for a rotational grazing system, some of the factors involved in making the decision, a sacrifice area, a pasture plan, forage, fencing, and then finally end up with paddock management. In addition to that, we'll briefly discuss some of the advantages and disadvantages of a rotational grazing system, and then finally we'll wrap up the presentation with a take-home message. When I was putting this presentation together, I wanted to come up with a few objectives of what you as a participant would try to get out of this presentation. And this is what I came up with. The first one is to consider or evaluate the possibility of implementing a rotational grazing system, and secondly, to understand the key components of a rotational grazing system that allows for an informed decision to be reached. With these two objectives in mind, hopefully this gives us the opportunity to be successful with our efforts. Okay, starting off with grazing strategies. A continuous would essentially means that horses have access to a single pasture nearly all of the time. A partial season grazing, horses are restricted to grazing pasture only part of the year. So horses may only have access to a pasture in the spring to midsummer, or in the spring and the fall of the year. The next one is turnout with opportunity to graze. Horses have daily access to pasture for shorter periods. In this case, even though horses may have access to a pasture for shorter periods, multiple horses may be provided access to the same pasture or turnout lot over the period of a day. So an example of this would be with stalled horses, where management rotation includes allowing horses an allotted amount of time in a turnout lot. And then finally, what this presentation will entail and we'll talk about is rotational grazing. And that essentially is a pasture is divided into smaller cells or paddocks and rotating the use of each cell or paddock. The purpose for rotational grazing, there are really three of them that I could think of, and they are improve forage availability and quality. Okay, so we want something available and the quality of that within our pasture. It forces horses to graze uniformly. That's relatively speaking. Horses are notorious overgrazers, or selective grazers as we like to refer to them, where they have a preference for a specific plant and they may choose to specifically graze in that spot where that plant is. And then finally, managing more animals on less acreage. This could be as little as less than a half an acre, depending on how intensely you manage the pasture. However, With a rotational grazing system, you need to be committed to the process. And so this means that we need to be prepared to feed hay when needed. And that could all be dependent upon weather conditions and forage growth. There are several factors that play into deciding if you want to try rotational grazing for your horses. The first one here is goals of operation. It's important to identify what your goals are in regard to grazing and forage management. Oftentimes, forage management is at the bottom of the list of priorities of horse owners. However, the question always seems to remain of, my grazing area looks undesirable and I'm feeding more hay than I wish to. How can I keep my horses from overgrazing my pasture, or what can I plant or reseed to make good pasture? These appear to be very simple questions with not so simple answers most of the time. So we have to really be realistic about what our goals are, and it may play into how or what type of management practices we use. The two major factors that play a role in your goal setting will be land-based resources and the number of horses that you have. Evaluating your land-based resources, I like to term this as usable acres. In Michigan, we have lots of water, trees, and swamps. Even though a horse owner may own 15 acres, 8 of those may be appropriate for use because of the previous factors mentioned. This will help you determine what may be feasible for your planned goals. The second one is the number of horses. In very general terms, 2 acres of pasture is the recommended stocking density for climates such as Michigan. But as we all realize, it is dependent on seasonal variations and the part of the country in which you may reside. However, it may be very hard or nearly impossible to maintain any sort of vegetative cover if you have a large number of horses and a small tract of usable acres. So let's look at what are some of the key components of a rotational grazing system. They would include a sacrifice area, some sort of pasture plan, pasture productivity, fencing, and paddock management. No matter what size of horse farm, utilizing a sacrifice lot for your horses is essential when making the most of your resources. A sacrifice lot can simply be defined as a relatively small, non-grazable area that allows freedom of movement and or exercise for a horse. This designated area is different from what may be termed as a turnout with the opportunity to graze, as I previously mentioned, or an unmanaged pasture that is used extensively or overgrazed. One goal of a sacrifice lot is to protect pastures in times of inclement weather. When considering pasture productivity, this area or lot can be utilized in many different ways, including routine maintenance of pastures such as clipping, dragging, fixing fence, keeping horses off the pasture when the ground is muddy, resting pasture areas for regrowth of vegetation, and allowing this to serve for that purpose. Or you could also keep horses in a secure area while the barn stalls are being cleaned. So in these next few slides, we'll discuss some of the key considerations when setting up a sacrifice lot. As you can see in this picture, this is a designated sacrifice lot or area. Okay, it may not be perfect, but it is very effectively utilized for its intended purpose. So when we look at site location, when selecting a site location, take into consideration the location to other buildings and accessibility to pastures. We want to avoid wetland areas or any area that is in close proximity to surface waters or wells. A level area is preferred to prevent potential runoff of sediment and nutrients from manure. If possible, locate the sacrifice area in a south or east facing area. Okay, if you locate the sacrifice area in a south or east facing area, this will aid with drying out the area because north and west facing areas tend to be a little bit more shaded. If we look at the size, we want to try to keep the lot size to a minimum. Lot sizes may vary depending on the length of time and how they are used. The Midwest Plan Service Horse Facilities Handbook recommends providing at least 1,000 square foot per horse for an exercise area. Amenities. Okay, we need to have those amenities such as water, ample room to feed hay, shelter, and in addition to that, the appropriate fencing to keep those animals contained in that area when they're designated to be there. In addition to that, maintenance. Okay, provisions should be made to collect manure accumulations and runoff, okay, from that manure. Removing manure on a regular basis will aid with parasite and potentially odor control. I like to term this as debris management. Okay, we want to clean up the manure and old feed laying around. We want to keep it kind of clean to prevent areas for insects to breed and to essentially control some of the odor. The frequency of manure removal would depend on concentration of horses housed in the lot. The storm water collected from buildings in close proximity should be diverted away from the sacrifice lot. It is most ideal to have a vegetative filter strip or a thick stand of grasses such as pasture surrounding the sacrifice area to filter some of those sediments and nutrients that could potentially get washed away from the lot. Surface. It will be difficult to maintain vegetative cover in a sacrifice lot. So therefore, providing an improved foundation such as sand, crushed rock, or wood chips around high traffic areas may be beneficial when dealing with mud during wet weather. So as you can see, we'll go back to our picture of our sacrifice lot here. I have identified the water source, and I took this picture from the second story of this barn. The shelter for the horses is actually in the basement of this barn. As you can see, it's not perfect. However, it can be utilized very effectively. We have a gate. You can see the horse trailer parked in the background where we have easy access to get in there and clean it out or handle the horses as well. The runoff from this sacrifice lot essentially goes right into the pasture, or on the other side, on the far west side of it, it actually is a field crop. Crop to raise a field to raise crops. Okay, so when we're looking for a pasture plan as far as paddocks are concerned, how many? Okay, typically we want paddocks to supply approximately 7 days of grazing. Okay, it could be less than that. It could be 3 to 7 days, but in general, for every 7 days of grazing, a pasture will need at least, and I will repeat that, at least 21 days of rest. Okay, so when we're looking for number, we obviously need a minimum number of 2. Ideally 4 if you're looking at the previous comment of for every 7 days of grazing, a pasture will need at least 21 days of rest. But you can actually do a lot more if that's desired. So let's take a look at a farm that is considering implementing a rotational grazing system. As you can see here, I have identified this established pasture. It's 12 acres. There are 4 horses that are housed on this pasture. The red line that you see outlines essentially outlines the pasture. The red line signifies the perimeter fence of the property. The horses are stocked at 3 acres per horse. This respective pasture is on a very sandy soil, and therefore the stocking density is adjusted to kind of compensate for that. Okay, so the first thing that we would want to identify would be where would our sacrifice area be. As you can see, or as illustrated in this picture, this is the most natural fit for a sacrifice area in regard to this established pasture. In addition, it's easily accessible and has the appropriate amenities such as water and shelter and ample room. Okay, we can utilize that driveway for accessibility as far as feeding hay when we need to. We can get in there to clean out the manure, and in addition to that, it also provides accessibility for handling the horses. So let's look at one of the many ways that you could divide this pasture for a rotational grazing system. Okay, we have our sacrifice lot identified. The yellow line actually depicts of where that sacrifice lot would be, all the way up to the barn where the water source was. If you pay particular attention to how within that sacrifice area, how that it looks like it's tracked down, that's where the horses have been coming from the pasture to go get water. Okay, so for paddock number 1, okay, this is what we could do. You could actually see that the horses are identified in the picture there. I've kind of tried to outline that for you. Okay, so that would be the first paddock. Moving on to the second one here, this would be the second paddock. This run of temporary fence is approximately 800 feet long. Okay, so that's a pretty long run for temporary fencing. 800 feet, if you wanted to try to visualize it, would be about 2.5 football fields. Okay. Okay, this would be paddock number 3. This would be paddock number 4. Okay, and so then when we put all of this together, okay, this, as I stated before, this illustration represents just one of many different ways that this pasture could be subdivided into different types of paddocks. There are several ways, when you think about this logistically, that you could approach this. Okay, you could just install all 3 temporary fences and then go in order, like 7 days for paddock 1, you know, so on and so forth, through paddock 2, 3, and 4. Or if you only wanted to put up 2 temporary fences, a proposed order of paddock grazing rotation may consist of this. Okay, you could graze paddock 2 first, so you would install the temporary fence to establish paddock 2. Graze paddock 1 next, so your temporary fence in place would be the 1 fence, and then you could utilize your perimeter fence to make this paddock. Okay, up at the top where the white line signifies, so essentially you have paddock 1 established. Then you could graze paddock 4 after 1, so you can move one of the temporary fences that make paddock 2 down to make paddock 4 and utilize a perimeter fence for that as well. Once the horses are in the paddock, you can move the other temporary fence that made paddock 1 to make paddock 3. This essentially cuts this large pasture in half when horses are not grazing. So for an example, paddock 1 and paddock 2 are in the resting phase, and there are no temporary fence present to allow for paddock management. When we break all of this down, it really comes out to be about 3/4 of an acre per horse. So I just wanted to kind of go through that scenario to give you kind of some kind of indication when you're thinking about dividing your pasture. Try to think about it logistically and what may be most efficient for you to manage it. Okay, moving on to pasture productivity. When we start looking at pasture productivity, some of the elements involved in that will be the soil, pasture plants, forage height, and general resting guidelines. So when I get horse owners that call me up and they have questions about their horse pastures, one of the first questions that I ask is, have you had your soil analyzed lately? Okay, I was just recently on a farm, and this individual indicated to me that she had not tested her soil for over 20 years. Okay, we can guess all day on what actually the soil may need for those forage plants to be productive, but it's best to get your soil analyzed. Okay, this will give you an indication of what your soil is going to need. Examples of this will be lime, nitrogen, etc. However, the basic soil test will give a general nitrogen recommendation for a specific crop, but does not test for nitrogen specifically unless you indicate that. Soil should be tested every 3 years, and if you have 4 different pastures and you manage them differently, then you probably should take a soil test from each one of those pastures respectively. Places that may assist with this would be your local extension office, grain elevators, seed dealers sometimes do that. Other individuals that serve as crop consultants may also offer this service. Okay, so when we look at what tools you would need to soil test, well, you would need a soil probe or shovel, a clean plastic bucket, right? We don't want anything contaminating our soil sample. You really do need to take 15 to 20 random samples per field. As you can see illustrated in this picture here on the slide, is that what we have is kind of a Z-shaped pattern throughout the pasture. If we take random samples throughout this pattern, it should give us a good indication and a representative sample across that whole pasture. Okay, we want to take a slice of soil approximately 8 to 12 inches deep. We don't want to skim the surface. So essentially we want to be down there, what is sometimes is referred to as the root zone for those plants. We want to mix samples. We want to mix all of those 15 to 20 random samples together to get one representative sample of that area. And you want to submit approximately 4 cups of dry soil. That will ensure that you have enough soil to be analyzed. The other thing is we try to keep soil samples down within less than 20 acres in 20 acre increments. So moving on, the next thing is pasture plants. Okay, there is no single forage that is best for all situations. However, several forages, singly or in combinations, can make a good horse pasture. This slide represents forages classified as legumes or grasses and further defined as cool season grasses or warm season grasses. So when you look at legume plants, they're notable for their ability to fix atmospheric nitrogen, which essentially can be used in crop rotation to replenish the soil that has been depleted of nitrogen. Warm season grasses are plants that grow mostly from June through early September, and they are well adapted to hot, dry weather and will stay green in July and August. On the other hand, cool season grasses grow best in the spring and fall when the soil and air temperatures are cooler. So let's compare a few of these forage plants, starting with legumes, in regard to advantages and disadvantages. So if we look at alfalfa compared to bird's foot trefoil here. Okay, alfalfa advantages: it's highly nutritious, it's high yielding, and it has high palatability. Disadvantages of that: the fertility requirements need to be correct in order for it to be productive. It may require more management inputs, and it has a relatively short lifespan. Bird's foot trefoil, on the other hand, advantages of that is productive in low fertility, and it persists very well. However, it can be difficult to establish, it has low seeding vigor, and it has a lower palatability potentially when you compare it to alfalfa. If we look at the cool season grasses, such as Kentucky bluegrass and smooth brome grass, let's say here, Kentucky bluegrass is highly palatable to horses. They actually may prefer it over other grasses. It withstands close grazing well, and it forms a dense sod and it's widely adapted. Disadvantages of Kentucky bluegrass: it has poor drought tolerance and can potentially have lower yields when compared to smooth brome grass. Smooth brome grass, on the other hand, it's also very highly palatable to a horse, but has good drought tolerance and doesn't persist with close grazing would be a disadvantage of that. And in addition, it requires a higher fertility. As far as warm season grasses are concerned, Bermuda grass, or the old world blue stems, they have good production during summer, they tolerate close grazing, and they form a dense sod. It can be difficult and expensive to establish. The quality and palatability drops drastically with maturity. And so and it can be invasive as well. So with all of this said, if you are unsure of what type of forages to maintain in your pastures for your respective area, it may be most appropriate to consult with a forage specialist, i.e. educator from your local extension office, a seed dealer, or any other individual that is knowledgeable about forage production, but also has some knowledge about what may be appropriate for horses. And they can potentially help you identify what types of forages that may work well in regard to your soil type and the respective environmental conditions. Okay, so let's look at what is the correct forage height to graze or not to graze. An excellent tool to monitor forage height is a grazing stick. Pictured here is a Michigan grazing stick obtained from the NRCS that I have color coded for stop and go grazing. As you can hopefully see in the picture, as a general rule, you want to start grazing horses when the forage heights are around 6 to 10 inches tall, and remove horses to stop grazing when forage heights reaches an average of 3 to 4 inches. This may vary depending on your respective area and the type of pasture plants that you may maintain, as it relates to your geographic area. So when we look at the difference or the types of pasture plants here, okay, here's a comparison for grazing guidelines of two cool season grasses, Kentucky bluegrass and smooth brome grass. Okay, we previously discussed the advantages and disadvantages of these two grasses. But if you remember, both grasses were considered to be palatable to horses. However, the Kentucky bluegrass withstands closer grazing relatively well, and smooth brome grass doesn't persist with close grazing. So my forage specialist colleagues tell me that typically Kentucky bluegrass is considered to be a shorter growing cool season grass than smooth brome grass, which would indicate the difference in the grazing heights here. So this goes back to the general rule of thumb of grazing when forage plants are 6 to 10 inches tall, and stop grazing when plants are an average of 3 to 4 inches, depending on what types of forage plants you have in your pasture. So if we look at the difference between Kentucky bluegrass, we want to start grazing that when it's 4 to 6 inches, and we want to stop grazing it when it's 1 to 2. Compared to smooth brome grass, we may start grazing that at 8 to 10 inches and stop grazing at 3 to 4. So what is the forage resting guidelines? Well, obviously there are some factors that are involved with this, and that really is dependent upon the weather, the seasonal variation, and one way, especially for first-time horse owners that are trying to implement a rotational grazing system, would be to avoid using a strict calendar of entrance and exit dates. Actually, that may apply to everyone. You might be better off to monitor the grazing progress or the regrowth of the specific forage species that you have within your pastures. So, as stated in a previous slide, okay, when we look at forage resting guidelines, in general, for every 7 days of grazing, a pasture will need at least 7 days of grazing. A pasture will need, and more often than not, it may need more time to regrow. As you can see from this slide, the United States Department of Agriculture Natural Resources Conservation District from Missouri has proposed these set of forage resting guidelines as it relates to the cool and warm season grasses as well as legumes. So if we look at the cool season grasses, 14 to 16 days resting period during early spring, compared to the warm season grasses where it may be 14 to 21 days during early fast growth. Okay, and then you can see the seasonal variations throughout midsummer or summer or winter during different times for those respective grasses. And then legumes, 24 to 32 days throughout the growing season. So if we think back to the farm example and the proposed grazing plan with the 4 paddocks, okay, this would put each paddock rotation on a theoretical 21-day rest. However, as you can see from this slide, there may be specific times of the year, okay, where you have to be prepared to feed hay. That comes into play here, where the pasture has not regrown enough to allow the horses to graze. Okay, the resting periods for pastures will be largely dependent upon weather conditions of that particular year and in regard to your respective geographic region. So let's talk a little bit about fencing. Okay, perimeter versus interior. Perimeter, in my mind, is considered as a permanent fence. Okay, just as it was illustrated in the farm example. Okay, we had the perimeter fence going all the way around that respective pasture.